Today we'll be reading from Matthew 18, 21 to 35. Peter came to Jesus. He asked, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brothers or sisters who sin against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to collect all the money his servants owed him. As the king began to do it, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. The man was not able to pay, so his master gave an order. The man, his wife, and children, all he had owned had to be sold to pay back the debt that he owed. Then the servant fell on his knees in front of him. Give me time, he begged. I'll pay everything back. His master felt sorry for him. He forgave him what he owed and let him go. But then the servant went out and found one of the other servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he said. The other servant fell on his knees. Give me time, he begged. I'll pay it back. But the first servant refused. Instead, he went and had the men thrown into prison. The man would be held there until he could pay back what he owed. The other servants saw what happened and were very angry. They went and told their master everything that had happened. The master called the first servant in. You evil servant, he said. I forgave you what you owed because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have just had mercy on the other servant as I had mercy on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers, and he would be punished until he paid back everything he owed. This is how my Father in heaven will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother and sister from your heart. This is part of our story, and it's our job to keep telling it.
Thanks, Audrey, and thank you for reminding us that this is our story. It's part of our story as followers of Jesus, and that really matters because this is how Jesus wants us to follow him. So I want to start by asking a question. Here we go. Can a made-up story be true? Now think about that. This is an important question because as we continue to work through Matthew, we're going to find out that Jesus makes up a lot of stories to illustrate his point. Stories are called parables. That's how we know them. And parables do some interesting things. Parables usually start by pointing at something that we all agree to be true or good or acceptable within our society. And then the person telling the parable adds something that turns everything upside down, or it brings tension to the story. Usually it makes the audience a bit uncomfortable in some way. And then finally, parables usually end by leading the audience to some kind of deeper truth. Now that they've come through this tension and felt uncomfortable with the way things are, they see something even better as the parable comes to a close. So there are ways that we can see this happening in this parable of the unmerciful servant. First of all, we look at something that we all agree to be true or good. In fact, we should back up a little bit because right before Jesus tells this story, Peter asks him about forgiveness. Now I think Peter is thinking about justice and mercy and how often we demand justice. We want justice when we've been wronged, and we want mercy when we've been the one doing the wrong. And Peter's trying, I think, to follow Jesus and to say, I know what Jesus wants here. And so he says, trying to be generous. How many times should I forgive? 7 times? And of course, Jesus' response is, no, not even close. And that's important. Think about that. I'm not going to lead you all the way, but give that some thought. And then Jesus tells this parable. And so first thing he's pointing out, that as the audience, we hear this, is that if we're the servant who owed our master, that it feels really good to be forgiven. It's a relief, and we feel that as that part of the story unfolds. And then Jesus adds the tension. He says that same servant encounters another servant who owes him just like he owed the master. And then he demands justice. And that's meant to make us feel a little bit uncomfortable because we don't really like what we see in that unmerciful servant. But there's a question we have to ask. Are we ever like that unmerciful servant, demanding justice when we would like to have forgiveness ourselves? Then finally, Jesus lands us in a deeper truth, a truth in this case about the kingdom of God, which is how he's trying to describe in this parable. And he says that this is what the kingdom of God will be like. We will be forgiven in the same way that we forgive. And so, in this parable and in all parables, there's some questions we can ask to help us interact with and understand what's happening in any parable. Questions like, who am I in the story? Or who do I want to be in the story? What parts of the story make me feel good? What parts of the story make me feel uncomfortable, or that tension we've talked about? And if you identify somebody in the story that you don't want to be like, it's important to ask the question, have I ever been like that, or could I imagine myself being like that? And what's the deeper truth that I'm supposed to get at the end of this parable, this made-up story? Just as a side note as well, sometimes or often Jesus tells parables that involve a rich person. Usually, we don't like to think of ourselves as the rich person in a parable. Usually the rich person doesn't come out very well in Jesus' parables. But the truth is, because of where we live, because of the society we live in and the benefits that we have, in pretty much every case in the parables of Jesus where there's a rich person, we're most likely like the rich person. And if we can accept that, we can understand what Jesus is trying to teach us and change and be transformed by the story. And I think that's ultimately the point of parables, whether it's the parable of the unmerciful servant that we're talking about today, or the prodigal son, or the good Samaritan, or any of these familiar stories that Jesus told that we usually know, is that we need to go deeper. We need to read into the story and think about who we are, who we want to be, who we don't want to be. How do we act? Can we learn something that helps us to be a better follower of Jesus and a better citizen of the kingdom of God as we do? So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to invite you to maybe read that parable of the unmerciful servant again and use some of those questions as a lens to hear this story with new ears and to understand what Jesus is trying to teach you and how you can live out what you've learned. I hope that's helpful as we continue to move through Matthew and hear more and more parables of Jesus, that you'll have a new way to read these familiar stories and apply them to your life.